Picture this. You're squeezing through a hole barely wide enough for your shoulders. Total darkness all around. The smell of wet dirt and something worse filling your lungs. And somewhere ahead of you, the enemy is waiting. That's not a nightmare. That was Tuesday for the tunnel rats of Vietnam. Now here's the thing. Most people know about the airstrikes, the napalm, the helicopters. But very few stop to think about what it was like down below. Underground. In a world where the rules of combat didn't just change, they were completely thrown out the window. So today, we're going down into the Coochie tunnel system, and we're going to talk about something that sounds almost impossible. How on earth did these soldiers sleep, rest, and stay sharp in conditions that would make most people lose their minds in minutes? Because here's the deal. Sleep is not a luxury. Sleep is survival. And when you're a tunnel rat, figuring out when and how to catch even a few minutes of rest without getting your throat cut is a tactical problem just as serious as any firefight above ground. So buckle up because this story goes deep. And I mean that literally. First, let's set the scene. The Coochie tunnel network was not some raggedy dirt hole. This thing was a full-blown underground city, stretching over 200 miles beneath the jungle floor of South Vietnam. The Viet Cong had been building it since the late 1940s, long before American boots ever hit Vietnamese soil. By the time US forces realized what they were dealing with, the system had multiple levels, some going as deep as 30 feet underground. There were hospitals down there, kitchens, meeting rooms, weapon storage, and of course fighters who knew every inch of those tunnels the way you know your own house in the dark. Now enter the tunnel rats. These were specially selected American and Australian soldiers. Small in frame, big in nerve, whose job was to go in armed with little more than a flashlight, a pistol, and what the veterans would later describe as a whole lot of guts and a little bit of crazy. Does that give you chills? Because it should. These weren't men with a death wish. These were professionals operating in the most psychologically demanding environment a soldier can face. And one of the biggest challenges? Staying functional, which meant, at some point, sleeping. Now here's where it gets fascinating, and honestly a little wild. Sleep for a tunnel rat was nothing like what you'd imagine. There were no cots, no sleeping bags rolled out in a nice safe corner. In fact, one of the first things these soldiers learned was this. Comfort is a trap. Getting too comfortable underground meant letting your guard down. And letting your guard down underground meant you might not wake up at all. So what did they actually do? Let's break it down. The first thing to understand is that the tunnel rats rarely operated solo for extended periods. When a team went in, they established a rotation, almost like a watch system. One man moved forward to clear the tunnel, while another held position a few feet back, covering the rear. This meant that at any given time, at least one soldier was in a static position, aware, listening, waiting. Could you grab a few minutes of light sleep in that position? Some veterans say yes, not deep sleep. Not the kind of sleep where you're dreaming about home, but that half-awake, half-alert state that soldiers in extreme environments learn to navigate, what some researchers call microsleep, and what the guys themselves called keeping one eye open. And keeping one eye open down there was not just a figure of speech. It was a genuine survival skill. You see, inside those tunnels, your eyes were basically useless anyway. It was pitch black. The Viet Cong were well known for cutting the wiring to any light source they couldn't use themselves. So vision became almost secondary. What the tunnel rats relied on, what they trained their bodies to rely on, were their other senses. Hearing, smell, touch, even vibration. Veterans have described being able to feel the movement of air that told them a tunnel was occupied. They could hear, at remarkable distances, the soft shuffle of feet on packed earth. They learned what wet soil smelled like versus the smell of a recently extinguished cooking fire. They became, in essence, human detection systems. So imagine trying to sleep while your senses are tuned to that level of sensitivity. Every crack, every drip, every distant sound jolts you awake. And here's the thing. That wasn't entirely a bad thing. That heightened alertness was exactly what kept them alive. But it also meant that the line between sleeping and being awake was constantly blurred in the tunnels. It was less about actually shutting your eyes and more about cycling your body through periods of reduced activity while your mind stayed partially online. Now, what about the times when a team needed real rest? Like during longer missions that stretched over multiple hours or even days? Well, this is where the tactical thinking gets genuinely brilliant. And honestly, a little heartbreaking when you consider what these men were going through. Some sections of the tunnel system were wider than others, areas used by the Viet Cong as resting stations or storage rooms. When tunnel rats cleared one of these spaces, they would sometimes use it as a temporary safe zone. The entry points would be checked. Sometimes booby trap wires would be cut or disabled, and one soldier would stay alert while the others took turns resting against the tunnel wall, backs to the earth, weapons across their laps, ready to go in seconds. How do you sleep with a pistol in your lap in a dirt room underground? You do it because the alternative is not sleeping at all, and a soldier running on zero sleep becomes a liability to himself and everyone around him. You adapt. The human body is almost frighteningly good at adapting. Now let's talk about the psychological dimension of this, because honestly, the mental game was as hard as anything physical. You know what they say in English, you can get used to anything except a nail in your shoe. Well, these guys basically learned to sleep with the nail in the shoe. Claustrophobia, the fear of small spaces, was an automatic disqualification for tunnel rat duty. But even soldiers who didn't consider themselves claustrophobic found that the tunnels pushed them to their limits. The weight of the earth above you. The silence that wasn't really silence. It was a silence full of threat. The knowledge that a wrong move, a wrong sound, a wrong decision could mean not coming back up. How did they manage that psychologically? Here's the honest answer. Many of them didn't, fully. PTSD among Vietnam veterans is well documented, and tunnel rats specifically reported some of the most severe and long-lasting trauma symptoms. But in the moment, the thing that held them together was a combination of intense training, incredible unit cohesion, that bond between soldiers that's hard to explain unless you've been through something like it, and what one veteran called compartmentalization. You put the fear in a box, you close the lid, you do the job. You open the box later, or sometimes you never open it at all. But here's the part that really gets me. Even in that box, even in those tunnels, these men found ways to be human. There are accounts of soldiers waiting in the dark for their turn to move forward, quietly reciting prayers they'd learned as kids. Some would tap out rhythms on the tunnel floor to remind themselves of music, of home, of something other than where they were. Some would run through memories, the last meal they had back at base, what they were going to do when they got home, conversations with family. These were not distractions from the mission. These were psychological survival tools, keeping the mind anchored to something real, something outside the tunnel. Can you imagine that? Lying in the pitch dark, underground in enemy territory, trying to remember the smell of your mother's kitchen to keep yourself sane? That right there is what the phrase grit and determination actually looks like in practice. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic, it's quietly, almost invisibly heroic. Now, let's talk about staying alert, because there's a difference between sleeping and being awake, sure, but there's also a spectrum within being awake. There's alert, there's hyper-alert, and then there's that burned-out, flat-eyed exhaustion where you're technically awake but your brain has gone somewhere else. Tunnel rats were constantly fighting that third state. Some of the methods they used are things we'd recognize today from what we know about military performance and sleep science. Short rotations were key. Rather than pushing any one soldier to the limit, teams would rotate responsibilities frequently. The man on point, the one moving through the tunnel first, was rotated so that no individual stayed in that position of maximum stress for too long. Think of it like running a relay race in the dark, where dropping the baton means something you don't want to think about. Food and hydration played a role too, though both were challenging underground. Eating in a tunnel is a quiet affair by necessity. The sound of a wrapper crinkling, the smell of food, these were real tactical concerns. A soldier eating a sea ration in a Viet Cong tunnel was advertising his position. So calories were often consumed quickly, efficiently, and with an eye on noise and smell management. Dehydration was a constant problem. The tunnels were humid, but finding safe water underground was obviously not something you could count on. And then there was sound. Sound in the tunnels was everything. The Viet Cong understood this and used it strategically. There are documented cases of the enemy creating sounds, dragging objects, simulating movement, to confuse and disorient American soldiers in the tunnels. The psychological warfare extended underground. So staying alert wasn't just about staying awake. It was about correctly interpreting what your ears were telling you. False signals were real and dangerous. A tunnel rat who overreacted to every sound burned through his reserves quickly. One who underreacted could end up in serious trouble. Finding that balance, the correct calibration of attention, was a skill developed through experience, through training, and through the kind of hard lessons that nobody volunteers for. There's a term in psychology called hypervigilance, a state of being constantly on alert for threat, where the nervous system is essentially always running hot. It's a hallmark of trauma, but in the tunnels, it was also a tactical requirement. The cruel irony of being a tunnel rat is that the very state that kept you alive underground was also the state that could unravel you once you came back to the surface. These men's nervous systems were recalibrated by their experiences in ways that didn't simply reset when the mission was over. Does that make you think differently about what these soldiers went through? Because it should. We talk about bravery in terms of charges and firefights and dramatic last stands. But bravery in the dark, bravery in the silence, bravery when the threat could be anywhere and everywhere and nowhere, that's a different kind of courage. That's the kind you don't necessarily see coming until you're already inside it. Now here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The Viet Cong soldiers living in those tunnels faced many of the same challenges. For them, the tunnels were not temporary. They were home. Entire cells of fighters lived underground for months at a time. Their sleep schedules, their daily rhythms, their lives were organized around the tunnel system. They had designated sleeping areas, simple platforms cut into the tunnel walls, sometimes just a mat rolled out on packed earth. They developed their own routines, their own ways of coping. This wasn't just a military operation for them. It was an existence. And in a strange, uncomfortable way, understanding that makes the whole picture more complete. The Coochie tunnels were not just a military asset. They were a world, a parallel world operating beneath the surface of the Vietnam War, with its own rules, its own rhythms, its own humanity, on both sides. Coming back to our tunnel rats, what happened when they came out? After hours, sometimes days, underground, emerging into sunlight was its own kind of shock. Veterans describe a disorientation that went beyond just adjusting to the light. The world felt too big, too open, too loud. The skills that had kept them alive underground, the constant monitoring of sounds, the hyper-awareness of space and position, those didn't switch off just because the mission was over. Some soldiers found themselves checking rooms for tunnels. Some struggled to sleep in open environments because the openness itself felt like exposure. The readjustment was part of the job, and the military offered limited support for it at the time. The psychological understanding of combat trauma in the 1960s and early 70s was nowhere near what it is today. Many tunnel rats came home carrying what they'd experienced underground and had to figure out, largely on their own, how to carry it. There's a phrase in English, "You don't know what you don't know." For the brass planning the Vietnam War above ground, the tunnel systems were initially almost incomprehensible. The idea that the enemy had built a city underground, that they were living and sleeping and operating there, was genuinely difficult to wrap their heads around. It took the tunnel rats, those small, tough, remarkably adaptable soldiers, to go down and find out what was actually there. And what they found changed the understanding of guerrilla warfare in ways that are still studied in military academies today. The Coochie tunnel system is considered one of the most significant examples of asymmetric warfare in modern military history. The idea that a less equipped force could create a strategic advantage not through superior firepower, but through the creative use of terrain, specifically the terrain beneath the feet of a more powerful enemy. That's a lesson that resonates far beyond Vietnam. But for all the strategy and history and military science of it, at the end of the day, we're talking about men. Men who slept in the dirt, who controlled their breathing in tight spaces, who let their senses do what their eyes couldn't. Men who learned to rest without sleeping, to trust without seeing, to keep going in conditions designed to make keeping going feel impossible. The tunnel rats were not superhuman, they were human. Maybe more human in some ways than the version of soldiers we like to imagine. They were scared, they were exhausted. They were doing math in their heads constantly. How much air is in this space? How long can I wait here? What was that sound? Is that a wire or a root? And in between all of that, somehow they slept. Somehow they kept their minds sharp enough to do the job and come back up. That's not a small thing. That's one of the more remarkable feats of human adaptation in the history of modern warfare. And the next time you're having trouble sleeping, maybe it's too bright, or too loud, or the mattress isn't quite right. Think about the men who learned to sleep 30 feet underground in the dark, in the silence that wasn't silence, in the earth that held both danger and, for a few minutes at a time, something close enough to rest to keep them going. If you made it to the end of this video, that's exactly the kind of person we make content for. Curious, serious about understanding history the way it actually was, not the cleaned up, made-for-TV version. Hit that subscribe button because we've got a lot more stories where this one came from. Stories that go below the surface, sometimes literally.